Hi, everybody.
All right, that was very good, very practical. I really appreciate that conversation. This is our chance now to tell you about the actual report that we worked on. I'm Arun Serafin, the Executive Director of National Defense Industrial Association's Emerging Technologies Institute. And we, in partnership with George Mason University's Costello School of Business's Baroni Center, worked on this study on looking at prototyping. And I think it's nice to hear that important people and smart people like that didn't say anything that contradicts what we wrote. So that's good start. We got into this, I think, because, we have a lot of experience between staff at NDIA and staff at George Mason with people who have a lot of former government, former industry experience. And we've experienced the last 25 years or last decade of people trying to go faster with acquisition. And I think we're at a moment where we felt like there's been a lot of legislation written to align acquisition policy, contracting methods to try to go faster. We think there's a lot of rhetoric and discussion about the use of prototyping to try to go faster. We even think, and it came up in the first panel, that there is a lot of funding mechanisms that have been created to try to go faster. And so with all of that, and then, who could possibly argue we all want to do prototyping? We wanted to ask the question, especially to the NDIA membership, okay, what do you think? How do you think things are going? And I think what we tried to look at through the research was, does industry feel like these different activities are actually helping, or do we need to at least send a message to Washington in general about how we should really try to structure these prototyping activities to be more efficient and effective going forward? So that's what we're going to try to talk to you about today. And we didn't realize that a big important part of that activity was like this panel this morning. Another part of that activity will be what we hear after the break. But what we really want to take our time on the stage is kind of give you the results of our research. So I'm going to introduce Anna Kim, who's a research associate at the Emerging Technologies Institute, and Stephanie Halcrow, who's a fellow with the Baroni Center, to talk in detail about the work that I got to do with them.
Thanks, Arun. Appreciate it. You said these just come on, right? Or you have to turn them on? Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. So thanks, Arun. Thanks to all of you for coming out. There is a printed copy of the report. It was out on the desk out there. I just put it up here so you could see it. I think it looks really great. Thanks to all the folks who not only obviously participated in the writing of it, but, formatting it takes some efforts as well. And so Charlie Dolgus, are you here? You're here. There you are in the back. So he is the crack formatter that makes all of these things look really awesome. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. So I have the clicker. On the next slide, I can't really see it. So Arun kind of set the stage about what the report was trying to accomplish, touched on some of the things that we found in the report, but we're going to go through that in more detail. But these are some of the questions that we asked ourselves, we asked industry, and the partnering with NDIA, I think, was super important because we had a way to get to a lot of industry input and government input for that matter. And so, Anna, I'll turn it over to you just to talk a little bit about the methodology, how much input we got on this report, who participated, and then we'll get into some of the findings.
Yeah, so briefly, this is the methodology that we used. As Arun and Stephanie mentioned, we like to use our membership as a resource for our research whenever we can. So in addition to the research that we conducted individually, we sent a survey out to the NDIA membership base. We got over 200 responses, and we'll break those down in the next slide a bit in terms of who responded and what the base consisted of. We held 2 webinars with the Baroni Center, and then also conducted NDIA-led workshops and follow-on interviews with participants of those webinars and workshops to get a bit more information. So to highlight some of the demographic responses to the survey. First is on organizational focus. You can see aerospace was the most represented category here, but the rest are pretty even between ground vehicles to electronics and communications, et cetera. In terms of organizational type, this was pretty interesting. Small business was pretty far ahead of everything else. And then there's also splits between traditional defense contractors, non-traditionals, academia, and consortium members, et cetera. One thing to note here for this chart is that respondents could select more than one option when answering this question. So it may well be that members of a consortia also fall within one or more of the other categories as well.
And the same thing for sectors that they worked in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think instead of viewing this report as just a couple people that sat around the table and bounced ideas past each other, there was a lot of input from industry, from government. I have no idea what I did. So the next slide is going to talk about the power of prototyping, title of this event as well. But to think about what are the different things that we get out of prototyping that enhance national security. So as you approach this, if you're industry, academia, government, you may have different views of why you would do prototyping and what the benefits are of giving out of that. So we actually surveyed the members and said, okay, why do you think we prototype? What's the power to you? And it was interesting because, and probably not surprising, but a large number of people said that their industry survey respondents said that the number one reason why that they want to participate in prototyping is with the hope to transition to a program of record. Not surprising. I would actually say it was kind of surprising that it wasn't more. I mean, in my opinion, I thought industry would respond very high in that area. They also responded pretty high that they would like to transition to an existing program of record or existing weapon system. So not just it be a program of record, but actually be integrated into an existing weapon system. I think that also is very telling that there is a good amount of industry that says, hey, program of record, maybe we talk about the Holy Grail, but we're making a widget and we understand that the widget won't be the actual program of record. We want to get it into a program of record. So industry defines success as those two things. As you can see, the last item up here is the idea of furthering knowledge. Industry does not define success as furthering knowledge, as I like to say. So, academia folks might, scientists might say, oh, okay, we're doing these prototyping things because we want to write a report and we want to show that we, have gained some sort of knowledge. Industry, by and large, does not view it that way. So I think that's important as prototyping is approached, that if the government says, hey, this effort is to further knowledge, at least there's a managing of expectations. If it is to lead to something else, let's say that as well. Some of the other things that we found from conversations that are powers of prototyping include developing the next generation workforce. I know Arun says this often, the first time somebody does some engineering, it shouldn't be on the F-35. Hopefully they've done some engineering on other programs before they get to that point. And so prototyping can be the means to that. And potentially there is a place for prototyping to do just that. One of the case studies that we highlighted in the paper was about a program called Defense Civilian Training Corps. Think ROTC for the civil workforce, DCTC. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of that, Defense Civilian Training Corps. So 2-year program, ROTC, like for the civilian federal workforce for DOD. And in that program, they include a internship in the summer. But what's unique about that internship is that is with a government office, but the expectation is that there's an actual program that they're working on, that there's an actual prototype that will be accomplished and delivered during their internship, and then the program office will pick that up. So here you are developing the next generation's workforce, specifically using prototyping as part of that idea. So you see the other activities there. We have another case study in the paper that talks about the vaccine for COVID-19 and how prototyping of the manufacturing industrial base was part of the prototyping effort. And so those are two case studies that are included in there. Anna, let me turn it over to you to talk to best practices of prototyping. As we thought about the value of prototyping, the power of prototyping, we noticed some key things that prototyping activities had and or should have.
Absolutely. So you see here the list of best practices that we pulled together based, like Stephanie said, on what we heard from the survey, from the interviews, the workshops, and from researching prototyping programs. And we pulled those together into this set of best practices for really all sides of prototyping activities. The first is to collaboratively commit resources to prototyping. And this means not only physical resources or funding, but also time and focus. And then the next two, to understand the real problem that a prototype is trying to address as it begins. And then similarly, and this was mentioned in the previous panel, to develop thoughtful requirements. One thing that I thought was really interesting, if you can read that chart, I'm not sure if it's too small, but in our survey, we asked respondents to rank what was important to them in a contract for successful prototyping related work. And far and away, the most popular answer was communications with the government about requirements over time, requirements. And that ranked even above time to award or built-in access to follow-on contracting opportunities. So I think that speaks to maybe a need for deeper communication, which was mentioned previously, even if prototyping is informing requirements as opposed to being based off of requirements, that communication still needs to be there and be strong. Similarly, to use international standards, I think what we mean there is, to simplify standards wherever possible to make them more accessible, which might potentially mean looking at military standards and then how those compare against international standards. Next, we have embracing digital acquisition. And I know digital engineering has been sort of in the news everywhere recently with the F-35 program opening a digital twinning facility and the next generation fighter jet engine using digital engineering. But by digital acquisition, we also mean things like digital requirements and digital acquisition so that the entire life cycle of the prototype is digital and can be captured in that way. And that can make, I think, the testing and evaluation process hopefully a lot easier. Similarly, pursuing simple and open design, for example, with MOSA. I think a theme between this one and the previous recommendation are that these might be slightly higher costs upfront, but ones that pay off in the longer run by making the prototyping process easier and more accessible. I think one of the big benefits of MOSA is to make it so that if you need to modernize a piece of a system later on, you can do that without having to upgrade the entire system as a whole. And then finally, these are all in service of prototyping iteratively, making sure that the knowledge that is produced by prototyping is captured and then builds on itself, not only for an individual program and having it end there, but across the prototyping community, really.
That's great. I was at an event on Wednesday that Govini put on, and they had a panel of retired military officers, active military officers in very senior roles. And, they were hitting on some of these, they were talking about prototyping, and they were hitting on some of these things. And I was like, oh, that's very nice to hear somebody else say things that we captured in our report, just like the panel earlier talked about it. But last night, having a conversation with Air Force requirements folks, and they talked, interestingly to me, about in their armament systems, going after modular open system architecture and putting that in their requirements, and how that was actually opening up their prototyping competitions to an industrial base that they otherwise weren't able to tap into, because they could say, oh, this is the connection that has to be made. This is the interfaces. And so anybody could participate. So just interesting how these things keep popping up in lots of different conversations. So it's not all good, though. So there are a lot of pain points. One of the things that we found very early on was that DoD and industry viewed prototyping, defined prototyping differently. And so when they went into the conversation, DoD was thinking about, hey, we just want to, see if this will work out. But industry was like, the prototype is the first step to build something that we're going to make many copies of. And so those definitions, I think, are very frustrating for DoD when they have a certain expectation and industry then says, well, this isn't what I wanted. I wanted, to make lots of these. And DoD says, well, I just wanted to see if it worked. So resolving those definitions is something that we're going to talk about as far as some next steps. Not that everybody has to agree upon what that prototype is going to be for, but understanding what the different definitions of prototyping can be. There's also a disagreement on what constitutes success. And even maybe there's not a measurement of what constitutes success. So one of the things that we talk in the paper about is the increase in funding for prototyping, but there's nowhere that is published by the Department of Defense to say, oh, the funding has increased, has doubled over the past 20 years, and we are getting double the results from it. So measuring it is one of the pain points in prototyping. And if you can't measure it, you can't evaluate outcomes. And then earlier in the previous panel, they talked about all sorts of different innovation organizations that are out there. And if you can't measure what they're doing and you can't evaluate the outcomes, how can you evaluate the different organizations? So we're going to talk about in some of our recommendations for next steps that if you put that in process, you can measure organizational models. You can determine which ones are most effective, and then you can duplicate them. And if the answer is, hey, these innovation organizations that are out there are the most effective, well, then how do we get the large acquisition programs to adopt some of their best practices? Resource requirements was touched on in the last panel. The thought that, hey, if you just throw money at prototyping, but you don't have an idea of how you're going to pull that prototyping through the acquisition process, you're just, I think, John Young said, you're just doing science in a sandbox, right? So let's think about what are those links to bringing the prototyping, understanding where you're going to get money to move it along the whole entire way. So just like to follow up on the next steps for DoD, Congress, and industry. Frankly, a lot of these steps are for DoD. Sorry, thanks. One to talk about is to resolve those conflicting definitions. DoD has a prototyping guidebook. It is really a fabulous document. If you've never taken a look at it, I highly recommend it. There's a lot of work that was put into that. I think this is just the evolution of that guidebook to resolve those definitions, to acknowledge that there are different definitions and resolve them between government, industry, and academia. Figure out a way how to measure success. Not every organizational's measure of success will be the same. Some organizations are very early in the prototyping process, some are later, but each organization should have a measure of success. Once you determine that, you can evaluate outcomes and you can model the most successful organizations. The other thing that we found in our conversations was that everybody talks about TRLs. very commonly people throw out technology readiness levels, but did you know there's a bunch of other readiness levels out there? And if you're going to talk about prototyping and how to integrate it into a existing system of weapon system, or if you're going to talk about how to transition it to a program of record, well, then maybe you need to be talking about manufacturing readiness levels. Maybe you need to be talking about sustainment readiness levels. There's all sorts of other readiness levels, and they are rarely talked about and frankly not included in Department of Defense activities like to the same level that TRL is. It was talked about earlier in the panel about aligning stakeholders. I think that is super important. Prototyping, if a prototyping activity is happening, there should be some idea of what customer that is going to support at the end. And so when you get technology to the point that you're doing prototyping, there should be some alignment to the stakeholders. Something that came out that was fairly interesting to talk about with some of the industry, academia, FFRDC partners is they said, we would really love to be able to share our knowledge so that we weren't duplicating efforts and so that we weren't starting from the beginning on these different projects and so that we could build on efforts that were previously done. And so when you said, well, don't you have a knowledge sharing capability? These very highly technical organizations that do a lot of prototyping said, no, we don't have it. Other than like loading reports into a shared database, right? But there was no formal knowledge sharing. That was really shocking to me. So if some of these very sophisticated organizations don't have it, I would imagine that all 300 innovation organizations out there don't have access to it either. And the duplication of prototyping is certainly happening. And I know Doug Bush said that it's probably a good thing, but I wonder what we could do if we understood the amount of duplication and we're able to eliminate the non-value added. And then our final recommendation in the paper is to adopt the best practices in this paper. I think Arun is going to talk about kind of our thoughts on the next step for this research. And one of those things is that we want to validate these best practices. A lot of folks talk about prototyping activities where the SecDef or a 4-star is the action officer. Things like MREP comes up. And I'm sure there's all sorts of great, I know there are all sorts of great prototyping activities out there that move through the process, through the acquisition system that currently exists. So how can we validate the best practices that we put in this paper and say, okay, in these programs that are existing, that are doing good work, and document that, and again, distribute that to model those programs. So that is, I think we might have some questions.
We have questions.
Yeah.
Before we talk about what we're going to do next, let's put you on the spot. A couple questions.
Yes.
I think this one ties off of this last slide here. Any thoughts on how to go from prototyping to production? What did the survey respondents to the workshop participants talk about their ideas on that?
Yeah, I think that was part of the best practices that we talked about. And the panel before talked a little bit about it as well, is that when a prototyping activity starts and is initiated by the Department of Defense, understanding what the path is, even if it's informing requirements or validating requirements, regardless of that, understanding what the path is to move it through integration into an existing weapon system or transition to a program of record to get into production. That requires alignment of stakeholders. So there's a little bit of an organizational issue in the department because much of the prototyping happens in one community and acquisition programs happen in the other. but frankly, that's what collaboration is about, is finding those themes, talking to those folks. I do think that something that Doug Bush and I talked about earlier this week, that I don't think he brought up this morning was, and this is about aligning of stakeholders, is that, prototyping is sometimes done to validate requirements and get the requirements community to like say, yes, that meets our needs, to get Congress to say, yes, that's what we're looking for, get the user to say, oh, it meets our needs. But sometimes it's also to buy into what can be done. And I think that's another aspect of aligning stakeholders.
And I think on the money side, there's a couple of things that came up both in this work and in the PPB Commission work that I participated in. One was make use of the flexibility that's already in the system. And I think John and Doug talked about this a lot, that you may not be able to get from a 6-1 program to full rate production with the same color of money, but you can get away with a lot with your 6.3 and 6.4 and 6.7 dollars. In the software world, you can get away with a lot in using O&M dollars. Every service has an account called other procurement. And you can get away with a lot with other procurement accounts. And so that's not illegal as long as you tell the CAPES and the comptrollers of the world and the appropriation staffers of the world, I intend to try to pull this and mature this technology using prototyping to move into at least low rate production. We think that's an acceptable use of the money, and that's one that people have exercised in the past. I think on the department side, when you think about moving from prototyping to production, one of the things the commission saw is that the department spends over $100 billion a year for R&D, T&E, and it never seems to think that any of it's going to work because it never budgets for the success of any of it. And so it's almost a surprise in the budgeting process that the stuff they actually funded worked. And then you're sort of back to start, like, oh, that actually worked. Let me get you into the POM process, stand by for 2 years. We'll have some money for you. Well, if you could bring at least parts of the department to sort of anticipate success and put some money into the POM to absorb some of that success, which then, to get into the weeds here, you would have to reallocate in time for your actual budget request, because you don't want to show up on the Hill with a trust me account, because they don't. You could do that reallocation right before the request goes over. You could do that reallocation in a mid-year budget amendment. You could do that reallocation through reprogramming with communication to the department, but that would let you do a little more seamless prototyping to production transition, at least from the money side. I think on the contracting side and on the program structure side, we've written a lot over the years from my old Capitol Hill perspectives and Stephanie's perspective, and I think Ms. Lord did a lot on adaptive acquisition framework. I'm happy to entertain more ideas on more clever program structures and contracting authorities. I think we're tapped out. I think you can do everything you need to do, but I'm always open to another idea. I think money and requirements are the biggest things to go after, but even there, I think there's promise. Okay, another question here. It's about software and business systems. Did anyone talk about whether the prototyping for those kinds of IT-based systems is any different?
Well, one thing I know we talked about as we were discussing this is that though our research was pretty focused on hardware prototyping, some of the best practices that we recommend for hardware prototyping are already incorporated into much of the software prototyping that happens. For example, when you talk about things like digital engineering or prototyping iteratively, a lot of that is baked into the way that software is already prototyped. So we actually saw that as a place where you could take lessons for the type of prototyping that we're talking about.
That's perfect. Great answer.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that we've seen on the software side is that they are continuously prototyping, and they're very proud of telling us that they're continuously prototyping. They are continuously working with the users, and maybe this is because the requirement system doesn't understand software. They don't feel as constrained. They don't seem to complain about the requirements process as much as the folks working in hardware, and maybe we should keep that a secret or something because they're getting away with a lot. But I think that if anything, the hardware parts of the universe can learn a lot from the software parts of the universe, and we should sort of see what we can bring over. And then we're required by law to answer a question about continuing resolutions, and so there is one here. How has the increasing amount of time spent in continuing resolutions affected our ability to leverage prototyping? It's bad, okay? It's a fact. But on the other hand, in a world when we had less continuing resolutions, no one in this room, and some of you I know have been in this room a long time with me thinking about these things, it's not like the world was perfect back then. There's a lot of self-inflicted wounds, regardless of continuing resolutions. Continuing resolutions, and this is something the commission talked about, actually do have a lot of flexibility built into them, arguably more than an actual appropriations bill. There are certain things you can't do, but moving things that exist already through the system isn't something necessarily that a continuing resolution is going to stop you from doing. Starting new things is really hard. We're talking about moving things through the system. It might actually be easier. It's worth thinking about that. So with that, I wanted to say what we're thinking next. One of the things, like Stephanie said, is that we've written, a lot of people have recently written reports about how the acquisition system occasionally works. We all go to the same examples, work speed and MRAP and things like that. The common theme in all of those things was the action officer was a cabinet level secretary, or at least an undersecretary, and they forced success through the system. One of the things we've discovered through this work is it turns out the system actually works without that sometimes. And we'd like to pull up those examples, and we're going to reach out to our industry partners of where the system just kind of worked on its own, where prototyping actually did lead to production. To produce that set of best practices is sort of the playbook to give people cover to copy some of those best practices. So that's one thing I think we'd love to think about working with you on, and if people are interested in that, please approach us. The other is this question of software, I think, and whether there are lessons learned from software, especially in the commercial world, that can be applied to some of these prototyping activities, to move things through faster. And then the other, and we're already starting some work on this, is on that guidebook for finding the funding flexibilities. And so those are some of our thoughts on how to move forward. In general, my group at ETI likes to work on these kinds of things only after people in the NDIA membership or people in DoD come and say, we'd like you to work on this and we'll help. And then we trick you into doing all the work for us. And so, that's the way we like to approach these things. And so if, my team is here, Stephanie is here, if you guys are interested in working on those kinds of problems with us in this sort of style, we'd love to have you talk to us about that. So we're going to take a break now. Please be back in class here at 10:30 for the next session. And I think it's out in the lobby, right?
Yes, right. Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
thank you very much.